So, in thinking about which of these three drinks has the most caffeine, we can kind of look at that question in two different ways. The first way is probably the most obvious way. We can just look at the amount of caffeine along the bottom here and see which one has the most. So, the Red Bull has 80 milligrams of caffeine. The Coca-Cola had 34 milligrams of caffeine, and the coffee had 71 milligrams of caffeine. Now, just looking at that, it's probably obvious that the Red Bull has the most total caffeine, 80 milligrams of caffeine. Easy, right? Now, the second way, though, and probably the more accurate way that we can figure out which one has the most caffeine is by figuring out which one has the most caffeine per 1 milliliter. Now, you might notice the reason we have to do that is because all three of these drinks have a different volume, a different number of milliliters. Um, these are all significantly less than a half of a liter. Remember, it takes 1,000 milliliters to make a liter, so they're all less than that. They're all less than half of a liter, but all three of them are different amounts. Now, in order to figure out which one has the most caffeine, it would be really nice if we could compare the same amount. So how much caffeine would there be in 1 milliliter of Red Bull or 1 milliliter of Coca-Cola or 1 milliliter of coffee? If we could figure that out, then we would have something to compare where they're all the same, and then we could actually figure out which one has the most caffeine if we had the same amount of each. Now I'm going to show you how to do that. When we're doing that, we are going to figure out how many milligrams per milliliter. When we're talking about milligrams, that's measuring our caffeine. So how many milligrams per milliliter? Now it's gonna kind of seem backwards, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to be dividing here. But when we divide, we'll do the first one. Red Bull, I am going to divide 80 milligrams, and I'm going to actually divide that by our volume over here, which is 250 milliliters. The reason for that is because I want to ultimately find out how many grams there are per milliliter. How many grams per milliliter? So when we divide this out, we're going to kind of be going back to what it looks like to divide decimals because there's obviously an issue here because there's no group of 250 that we can make from 80. The reason is because we have more milliliters than we do grams. That means every milliliter cannot have a whole gram of caffeine. Every milliliter must have less than a gram of caffeine. Therefore, we're going to get a decimal answer. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I am going to add a decimal and a zero because remember that still represents 80. And I'm just going to go ahead because I know my answer is going to be less than one whole. I'm going to put a decimal and a zero here in my answer. Now, as we start to divide here, I'm going to say how many groups of 250 can I make from 80? So I'm going to go to the side and I'm going to count by 250s, which we can either count by 250 or we can just add 250 over and over. So another 250 would be 500, another 250 would be 750, another 250 would be 1,000. That shows me then that there's going to be three groups of 250, which would give me 750, which would give me a remainder of 50. And then as we do when we are dividing decimals, I'm just going to add another zero here and bring it down. Remember, that's still worth 80. How many 250s and 500? Two. So that one's kind of easy. So here's what information that we have now. We know that for Red Bull, we have 32 hundredths of a gram of caffeine per 1 milliliter. That means every milliliter of Red Bull has less than a half a gram of caffeine. Now, is that a lot or is that a little bit? We won't know until we find the other two. So every gram of Red Bull has, every milliliter of Red Bull has less than half of a gram, a little more than a fourth of a gram of caffeine. All right, let's look at the second one. So the Coca-Cola says 355 milliliters has 34 milligrams of caffeine. So I am going to do the same approach. I'm going to take 34 milligrams and I'm going to divide by 355. Now you may be able to tell this one's going to be a little tougher. So when I divide again, I'm going to put down my decimal in zero here. Remember, that's still worth 340, which then tells me that I can put zero in my answer. Now, you may notice here right from the start that we have a larger volume because before we only had 250 milliliters. Now we have 355, but we actually have less caffeine. So it's like there's more liquid, but there's less caffeine. That tells me right from the start that this number that we had with Red Bull, it's going to be even less for Coca Cola. There's going to be less caffeine per ounce because we have more drink, but we have less caffeine. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to think how many groups of 355 could go into 340. That's zero. So none. So we're less than a tenth here. I'm going to add another zero on. How many groups of 355 and 3,400? Now that gets kind of tough. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out a calculator. I'm going to do a little guessing and checking here. I know that 355, an easy way that I'm thinking this, 355 times 10 is 3,550. So I know it's less than 10. So you might try 9. So 9 times 355 would give me 3,195, which works. So I'm going to put a 9 here, which gives me 3,195. Subtract these two numbers, and I will get 205. Then I will bring down another zero. Now, one thing I will tell you here is this is going to end up being a repeating decimal. I'm actually going to stop at this point because what I've figured out is just enough information, really, that we have 900ths of a gram per 1 milliliter. That means we have less than a tenth, of a gram per 1 milliliter. Versus over here, we had 32 hundredths of a gram per milliliter. We had more than a fourth of a gram per milliliter. Here we have not even a tenth of a gram per milliliter. So this tells me that Red Bull has a lot more caffeine per milliliter than Coca-Cola does, almost 3 times as much caffeine per milliliter. Now, we could then go back and do the same thing with the coffee. And I'm going to let you try the coffee on your own. And I want you to see how it compares to the Red Bull and to the Coca-Cola. Now, remember, it's important to be able to figure out how many grams per milliliter because when we're looking at 1 milliliter of each, it's much easier to compare versus when we're looking at different volumes 250 milliliters, 355 milliliters, 177 milliliters. So, looking at the same volume of each helps us to have a much better idea of which one has the most caffeine. So, I want you to give this a shot and see if you can figure out which which drink has the most caffeine per milliliter.